documents and internally. Reagan said you can have it all right away. That was probably politically smart and politically necessary, but I think that's not necessarily an unalloyed good thing for an executive to do. My own sort of talking to people and reading the documents, and Reagan did not know about the diversion. I'm pretty sure that's correct. The diversion of funds from the sales to the Contras. He was fully in the loop about the transactions to try and free the hostages in Lebanon. And in fact, I'm pretty tough on him in my book. I said that was a dishonorable thing to do, born out of his extreme human sympathy. I mean, almost every day he would ask his national security advisors, is there any news on the hostages? And they were trying all kinds of stuff. Ross Perot offered to ransom them. They asked Prime Minister Nakasone, no, it wasn't him. Whoever the Japanese Prime Minister was at the time, because they had good business relations with the Iranians, would he please intercede with the Iranians to try and get them released? I mean, they tried a lot of things. And Reagan was in the middle of all of that. And I said that half of the initiative went forward because he wanted to. So you can't pass the buck on that one. I'm very tough on Oliver North in my book. I say that he had my summary of him, I mean, he was a very dashing guy, but I said he had the defect of courage that Aristotle said had no name, but the closest thing to it was reckless. And he was a reckless guy, not always faithful to the truth. He made a lot of stuff up. And yet, at the end of the day, he's the guy who turns around the whole thing politically in his dramatic testimony before Congress, which I'd kind of forgotten. I went back and read the transcript, because the Democrats kept leading with their chin, and he smacked them on the chin every time. It was an impressive performance, but only someone who may be slightly psychopathic could have pulled it off. So it's a mixed bag. But it's a complicated story, and there's several parts to it, and you'll never find a bright line on how you resolve some of those issues about, the executive prerogative of presidents. I quote a lot from Locke's chapter on prerogative, which should be read, I think, as a backdrop to thinking about that whole episode. The issue does have its echoes in some of the arguments about executive power under the Bush administration you've been through the last few years. So it's a good relevant case study that way. So I hope that helps a little bit, because it's a big story. And I do go into it quite a bit in the book. So.
I was wondering if you could tell us what you think Reagan would think about the so-called compassionate release of one of the Lockerbie bombings, because I know Gaddafi animated a lot of his early presidency.
Oh, yeah. I think he'd be pretty appalled. Yeah, we kind of forgot about all that. There really was some evidence, like with the Iranian business, we probably got a lot of people making up stories, but there was some evidence that, and we do know the Libyans were assassinating people in Europe. There was some thought in '81 that they were going to try and assassinate Reagan here in the country, and Nancy's in a panic because of what had happened in March. The U.S. considered at one point invading Libya with Egypt. Egypt really wanted to do it. The news got leaked to the Washington Post and kind of killed that idea. I don't think they would have done it. Reagan was very force-averse, actually, but they were always, and of course they did order the bombing raid in retaliation for the bombing of the disco in Berlin in 1986. So that was considered to be, Saddam Hussein, we got along fine with him. It was Gaddafi was the guy who was the pain in the neck in the 80s. I think he'd be thoroughly appalled at what happened after that, because the bombing of the airliner, it happened in Reagan's last 3 weeks in office. He wouldn't like that much.
I enjoyed the talk. I was wondering if you could tell us about how Reagan chose his advisors, and I don't know, maybe compare that to how other presidents since then have chosen advisors.
Yeah, well, the interesting story there, I think, is, and again, where I'm a bit revisionist, is during his administration, maybe you remember some of this or heard some of this. The argument was that the White House is riven by one big fault line between the ideologues, the Reaganites, and the pragmatists, those are the moderate Republicans, the James Baker types, and especially Baker, and Richard Darman. The line about Richard Darman was, why do people take an instant dislike to Darman? Saves time. there's some truth to this, although the media like to whip this up and exaggerate it. But there were those factions, and actually the big three. In the first term, there was the Troika, as it was called, which was Chief of Staff James Baker, Ed Meese, the counselor, and Mike Deaver, the director of, I forget what, director of Nancy, really, but he was the producer of the Reagan. He even described himself as that once. They actually got along fine and were pretty cordial, but below the staff level below that, it was often pretty bitter. I mean, people choosing sides at the tables and everything. However, I actually think that was a canny thing to do for a couple of reasons. One is Reagan did the same thing when he was governor. When he beat George Christopher, that was his Republican opponent in the primary in 1966. This is amazing. He'd been the mayor of San Francisco. There was, with a living memory, a Republican mayor of San Francisco. Which was how times have changed. He brought a bunch of Christopher's people into his campaign first and then the administration. Cap Weinberger had been a Rockefeller Republican who had sided with Christopher against Reagan in 66 and sided against Goldwater in 64. And you think of Weinberger as one of the great Reaganites, right? Well, that's because Reagan had this sort of magnetic field that made a lot of people into Reaganites. Not everybody, but a lot of them. The other thing is that the Republican Party was split between the rising conservatives and the old moderates. Today you think of moderate liberal Republican senators, it's the two ladies from Maine. In 1980, there were probably 16 Republican senators who looked like them. Bob Packwood, Lowell Weicker, who Reagan in his diary called a no-good pompous fathead. But anyway, Bob Packwood, you go down the list. People you've forgotten now, Mark Andrews of one of the Dakotas, Charles Percy of Illinois was a bigger problem to Reagan in confronting people in the State Department than Democrats ever were. And was always beating up Reagan about arms control and so forth. The argument I make is, again, slightly revisionist, is he replicated in his own administration the two wings of the Republican Party, and that was probably necessary. A purely ideological administration would have not been very successful. And I also agree with the David Hackett Fisher thesis that administrations that have vigorous arguments and disagreements are better administrations. It's true of Washington's cabinet, it's true of Lincoln's cabinet, FDR's, and the obvious question is there wasn't enough disagreement, or at least it wasn't organized in the right way in the most recent Bush administration, I think is a cogent and plausible hypothesis to think through. So I think it actually worked for him, and in many cases, not all cases, but in many cases, generated better policy and certainly more shrewd politics. So Reagan, it was interesting. Reagan had he liked competent people, but he also liked, he picked Drew Lewis to be his transportation secretary, very conventional Republican, and he'd been to Harvard Business School. And Reagan said, well, we won't hold that against him. So I don't know what his thought process was, because he never much articulated it. But I do think it worked for him by having both wings of the party represented in his White House.
I have a quick question for you. You mentioned the comment made by Obama about President Reagan, and also the academic scholarly change in the view of Reagan. Can you speak about what has caused that change? Why are liberals looking at Reagan differently today than maybe they looked at him 10 years ago? And also, what do you see as the legacy of Reagan for both conservative thought today as well as liberal thought?
Yeah, I think two things happened. One is just the passage of time and sort of the immediate partisan passions diminish. So this happened with Eisenhower. People always had contempt for Eisenhower until about 10 years after he left office. And then people like Murray Kempton and Fred Greenstein at Princeton and others started looking more closely at the documentary evidence and started to realize that he was actually much more clever, and that these obfuscations he'd make at press conference were absolutely calculated and deliberate, and behind the scenes he was very shrewd. In Reagan's case, I think as people thought more about the Cold War story, and you had people like Gorbachev giving Reagan Gorbachev gave Reagan more credit, say, than Time magazine did. No, I mean, Strobe Talbot, wrote the article on why Gorbachev was man of the decade in 1990. He barely mentions Reagan. Gorbachev's more generous than Strobe Talbot was. So there's some recognition of the merits of the matter. But then I think the other one was when it started coming out about 10 years ago that Reagan had written so much, all these radio addresses, the thousands of letters,